This is a story of breathtaking beauty from the plains of East Africa, but also one of tragedy and revenge. For generations, the lions of Kenya's Maasai Mara and the local people have lived side by side, sharing a spectacular homeland that has become world-renowned. But now a brutal fight for survival has broken out, and these same lions have been pitted against the community in a battle that has seen casualties on both sides. Today we delve into the complicated issue of human-wildlife conflict in Africa and try to find out what it will take to restore the Maasai Mara's pride. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, in December 2015, Kenya's environmental conscience was shaken when at least 2 members of the country's most famous pride of lions were found dead due to poisoning in the Maasai Mara Reserve, with 2 community members subsequently charged for the incident. Now, conflicts between lions and the Maasai herdsmen have increased in recent years, largely thanks to changes to traditional land use policies. The creation of privately owned plots of land around the borders of the Maasai Mara Reserve has seen many local herders settle with their livestock in the region, something which was bound to catch the attention of the lion population. CCTV's Lindy Mtongana went on safari in the Maasai Mara Reserve to find out what exactly has happened to Kenya's famous Marsh Pride.
A place of sweeping landscapes and of natural wonder. But these lions find themselves now on very dangerous ground. Television made the Marsh Pride world famous. But in December last year, disturbing reports emerged about them. Some lions were missing, others were behaving strangely. Young Alan was in serious pain. He survived thanks to the swift action of rangers and vets, but he never regained his strength and was eventually put down. As for the others, Bibi was found on her side with a distended stomach and foaming at the mouth. She died within minutes. And Sienna, too sick to fight back, was killed by hyenas, her remains left to rot in the sun. All 3 lions had been poisoned, and they weren't the only victims. Vulture too were found dead. For conservationists like Jonathan Scott, the deaths were a heavy blow.
If the Mara Reserve, a national game reserve, isn't a safe sanctuary for lions, then where is? People loved those lions. You know, they were totally engaged with their story. They came to see them, and we killed them.
But this wasn't about poaching. The lions had preyed on the herds of local Maasai. So the poisoning is thought to be revenge for the killing of what's most sacred to the Maasai, cattle. 2 suspects were arrested. They face up to 20 years behind bars.
The county government are really committed to ensure that animals are safe, and that is why we are following the suspect very seriously.
The boundary between the Maasai Mara National Reserve and the conservancies in which the Maasai community live is marked by this kind of concrete post. They're dotted about 2 kilometers apart, but that's it. No fence, no barrier.
It's common knowledge, but has been swept under the carpet, that tens of thousands of cows, cattle, livestock are brought into the reserve every night. So literally the physical surge of cattle moving into the reserve removes the grass. It displaces resident animals like topi, impala, warthogs, waterbuck. So some of the creatures which should be protected in the reserve are running out of food, are being displaced, and certainly in terms of lion numbers, we are told from some of the scientists studying these changes that lion numbers are now showing signs of distress.
The African lion population now sits at 35,000, down from 100,000 50 years ago. Conservationists say retaliatory and preemptive killings are the single greatest threat. The hunters are now themselves being hunted. And poisoning would suggest it's become personal.
And now to help further unpack this important issue and help search for solutions, I have expert guests standing by. In Nairobi, the Narok County Executive for Tourism and Wildlife, Ms. Lena Munge, and in Minneapolis in the United States, Dr. Craig Parker, Director of the Lion Research Center at the University of Minnesota. Thank you both for joining in the conversation. Lena Munge, I'll start off with you. You're in charge of tourism and wildlife in the Narok County. Now, the Marsh Pride lion poisoning has made global headlines in the recent past, though, but just clarify for us from the community's perspective, what is the scale of the challenge in the Maasai Mara? What is the degree of loss for the community?
Thank you. The Marsh Pride is probably one of the most famous pride of lions in the world. It was made famous by the BBC series, Wildcat Diaries, and it's been running for decades. So this was one of the most devastating actions that actually happened in the Mara, and I would say the government has taken it very seriously. The community has also taken it very seriously, and I think from a government perspective, the response was quite fast. 8 members of the Marsh Pride were actually poisoned, but because of the quick response, 3 of them died, but the other 5 were saved. So the matter is currently in court, and those who are arrested are facing prosecution. It's important to remember that these animals have coexisted with the local communities for generations, and the Mara actually exists because the communities preserve these animals for the world. Having said that, there are certain challenges which has emerged over the last few years. One, there is demarcation of land, and so the large pieces of land, community land, no longer exist. There's also increased population and urbanization, such that it's no longer a homogeneous community. There's integration of different communities. So what has happened is that the conflict has actually increased over time because of this reason. And the conflict is not just happening within the park, it's also happening in the communities, because these animals are not confined because the park is not fenced. So the animals go out to the villages and they do destroy people's property as well as lives. And the animals, what has happened is that because of drought and other situations, the local communities come into the park at night, and the cattle graze during the park and go out during the day. This is an emerging thing. It is not unique to the Mara, and it's actually a challenge for other wildlife authorities in the country.
Right. Dr. Parker, let's get your view here, though, because you ran the Serengeti Lion Project for years. What is your experience? What was your experience in the Serengeti?
I started working in the Serengeti myself in the late 1970s, and I continued working there until the last few years. And there was a marked trend in recent years for greater and greater conflict with the local Maasai living on the eastern side of the park. And I think that the officer from Narok has touched on some of the main problems, and that is that the human population has grown fantastically, and the livestock population had already reached pretty much its limits. So any losses of livestock today are much more harmful to the communities than they were in the past. There's real concerns, I think, about the future of some of these areas that rely on the free movement of animals back and forth in and out of these protected areas. And I'm quite concerned for the future of these so-called migratory systems, that they may not be viable if these conflicts continue to accelerate.
Right. Lena Munge, though, what is the solution, though, here to this human-wildlife conflict? What are you looking at as a proposition to end this challenge?
One of the things we need to realize is that the park is not fenced, so the animals are free to roam. But having said that, over the past few years, there's been a convergence, and local communities have put together their land and formed conservancies. This has been a major boost because the animals have a far wider area to disperse into, and the size of the conservancies is largely equal to the size of the park. Now, going forward, one of the key key considerations we're looking at is giving incentives to communities. If communities can be able to earn an income from setting aside land for conservation, then there would be enhanced protection of wildlife.
Lena, though, is fencing an option for you at the moment?
What I would say is the Mara is famous for the wild beast migration. It's in fact the wild beast migration that made the Mara one of the 7 new wonders of the world. And because of that, fencing may not be viable in certain areas. But we do consider the fact that as more and more villages and urban communities live closer to the park, we are not averse to considering certain segments which can be fenced to protect the wildlife.
Right.
But, yeah.
Dr. Parker, is that your view? Is fencing a viable option or may not be a viable option?
I think that fencing is something that really should be considered seriously. We've surveyed how lion populations are faring all over Africa, and there's a clear effectiveness that in southern Africa, which relies a lot more on fences than does East Africa, lion populations are actually thriving, unlike the rest of the continent. And the barrier, the safety that a fence produces is a tremendous help for these kinds of issues, because I think one of the most important things is to realize that this signals to the local communities that the wildlife authorities really do care about their safety and their livelihoods. And so, particularly in areas where you have high human population density, I think you have an excellent example of that in Kenya with Nairobi Park, which is fenced on the city side. The dispersal area at the south end of the park is not yet fenced and probably shouldn't be, because the animals need to disperse over a wide area. In the Mara, with these conservancies, one model might be to consider a fence on the outer perimeter of the conservancies, so that they would be on the inside of the wildlife area alongside the Mara itself. And so that wouldn't interfere with the movement of animals from the Tanzanian side of Serengeti up through Mara and into the conservancies. Another thing to consider along with all of that is, who has access to grazing in these conservancies. And if there are no barriers, there are no fences, then it's very hard to regulate who actually comes in. And so fences can serve a lot of good purposes in terms of improving land management practices in these areas.
All right, Lena Munge, though, the whole question of regulation, Dr. Parker has touched on that, the whole idea of fencing having a significant improvement on regulation. What's your view?
It really depends, because if you look at the Mara, there's the migration from Serengeti for the wild beasts. There's also the migration to the Loita Plains, which is far off from the conservancies around the Mara. So I think the fencing needs to be considered very carefully, because in certain parts of Africa where they've fenced with electric fence, they've had devastating effects on herbivores when they come across their natural migratory routes, and then they're killed by electric fences. So I think it's something which we need to be considered. In certain parks like Mount Kenya, where there's a very clear demarcation between farmlands and animal conservation, then fencing has been a viable option. But for the Mara, I think a lot more consideration need to be put in before fencing can be considered.
Dr. Parker, though, does this have an impact on the migratory patterns of the animals? Would fencing have an impact, for instance, on the corridors for the animals?
Oh, absolutely. And any fencing should be carefully engineered so that it avoids cutting off those migration routes. But I think that there are plenty of areas, and as the counselor described earlier, if you have villages, human habitation right next to these wildlife areas, that there's already a boundary there in a way, and the only thing that's going to happen when the animal leaves the protected area is to get into trouble. And so the conservationists should really work hand in hand with the other authorities to make sure that any fences are designed properly to avoid those kinds of devastating impacts. I believe that the examples we have in the past largely come from Botswana, where there were fences that were erected that cut off large-scale migrations. But those fences were designed by the livestock authorities. They were trying to prevent the diseases from spreading from wildlife into domestic livestock. They were not designed with any consideration of conservation whatsoever. So going forward, clearly there should be a very serious engagement between the conservationists and the local authorities about the location, the precise location, and the materials of any actual fencing.
Lorna Munger and Dr. Craig Parker, please stay with us as we are going to take a short break now. But when we come back, we'll continue this discussion on restoring the Marsh Pride. Stay with us.
In my view, is actually something that really hard and need something to be really done. Working together as community and stakeholders or county councils or people around the conservancies and national reserve to work together closely and make this animal safe. It's working as a team that will make you move forward for a better future.
That was Mara National Reserve Safari Guide Samuel Nchoy speaking of the current human-wildlife conflict situation in the Mara. Welcome back to Talk Africa. We continue from where we left off now as CCTV's Lindy Mtongana went in search of the Maasai community to find out their standpoint.
Aitong, a town in southern Kenya bordering the Maasai Mara Reserve. It's here, away from the city, you come to understand the value of simple things, like a single cow.
So the 3 on the fence, you get it from $600 each. But this one with the rump, you get it with 400.
Moses is a revenue collector at the weekly market, an expert on the business of cattle.
And then you get a market from Nairobi. That is where you sell good. That's where you get a good market.
Cattle mean far more than dollars, though. The people here keep their cattle enclosed within the village and keep them safe from predators, often by the simplest means.
They have a kind of sound they make to scare the lion.
Closer to the reserve, it's a different story. So we're parked right now on this contentious sort of boundary area where we're going to try and meet some Maasai herdsmen. We're not sure if they're going to be willing to talk to us, but the aim here is to get their side of the story. The poisoning of the Marsh Pride lions has put them on edge. 2 locals already are facing 20 years in jail if they're convicted. So these herders are willing to tell their side of the story, but only off camera.
Here they come.
Firstly, what came out of this is that they feel that the loss of livestock on this side has been far greater than the loss of wildlife on the side of the reserve. They say that the losses reach up to around 7 cows killed in the space of about 2 weeks. Now, when it comes to the matter of the Marsh Pride poisoning, the men that we spoke to say those 2 suspects are in fact innocent. They say no one here poisoned those lions. When I asked, well, how did they die? They said they must have been sick. What was definitely clear for me, though, was that despite the losses, despite the risks, these herdsmen are not moving. Shortly after we filmed this, lions struck again, killing 2 cows. That may sound like the natural order of things to you and I. Here, it's taken as a direct threat to the future of a community. Lindy Mtongana, CCTV, Maasai Mara, Kenya.
A direct threat to the future of the community, indeed. Now, Lena Munge, let me return to you, though, and I want to get your view from the side of the community, though. Are the communities that live in and around the reserve, are they aware of the importance of conserving that biodiversity?
Certainly, the local traditions is such that the lifestyle of pastoralists is very close to conservation, and that's why we have the Mara as it is right now. Having said that, the local communities benefit significantly from the Mara. Some of them have interests in the Mara. They have support from the community. We have the Maasai Mara Community Fund Bill, where a percentage of revenues from the park actually goes back to support community activities. So they're well aware about the importance of the Mara to their livelihood and to their livestock.
So, Lena, what about compensation, though, for the communities that are affected by the conflict?
Compensation is actually a very important subject. In the Wildlife Act, there's compensation of up to 5 million shillings for fatalities and up to 2 million shillings for injuries. This is a very heavy price for the government to bear. And I think last year alone, I think there was something like 5 billion in terms of claims, which is really very difficult to sustain. What we would advocate is setting up a conservation fund. All the lodges and camps and some of the private businesses which are operating in the Mara and deriving huge benefits from the Mara need to become partners to government in terms of setting up the compensation for the local communities, and that is one of the areas we would hope to pursue.
Well, Dr. Craig Parker, though, do you agree with the whole question of compensation, though? Is that enough to deter further conflict?
Wherever compensation has been found in Botswana, in Kenya, and in other parts of the world, there's so many problems with it because you can create what's called a perverse incentive. If you lavishly compensate for the loss of livestock to wildlife, then what you'll see is that people are losing their livestock to wildlife. And it's very difficult to validate every single claim. So administratively, it's very difficult. It's also incredibly expensive. An alternative to that would be to take a more reasoned approach that focuses on particular areas that you've designated as these are areas where we really want people to coexist with wildlife. We have a rough idea of how much losses are being suffered by those local communities, so how many millions of shillings that would be, but only in that area. And then rather than trying to validate every single cow and goat that's killed by a lion, you instead say, okay, we know roughly this is how much is being lost here. This money goes to the community, but in return, we have to have evidence that there's positive support for the conservation. So in Sweden, it's called a performance payment program, where the reindeer herders in northern Sweden are given a lump sum every year by the Swedish government that's meant to cover all those costs, plus provide positive incentives to live with the European carnivores like lynx and wolf and wolverine. And then there's an independent method of measuring, well, how many wolverines are there? How many lynx are there around there? And if there are more lynx, more wolverines, then that payment actually grows. So there's a direct link then to conservation. And it's not just people complaining about losing their cows and having a focus on the negativity and maybe not always getting their claims met.
Right, Dr. Craig Parker, though, we are looking at the various options available for controlling the damage in the human-wildlife scenario. But what is the actual current African population that's left now? And how will non-action, if there is no action to stop that, how will non-action affect that?
So we've recently completed a survey on the status of African lions across the entire continent. And there are quite striking differences across different regions of the continent. So in West Africa, there are very few lions left, and we're quite confident that there was a tremendous loss in the number of lions over the last few decades. In East Africa, it's a bit more mixed. Some places are doing very poorly, and some places are doing reasonably well. But overall, we think that there's a pretty good chance that about half of the lions from East Africa have been lost in the last couple of decades. In contrast, in southern Africa, and that's South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, lion populations down there are holding quite steady. South Africa has the advantage that they have both a very low human population density, like in Namibia, Botswana, rural Zimbabwe, and they also rely a lot more on fences. So the lion populations down there are reasonably well off in comparison to East Africa and Western Africa. In East Africa, I think there's reason to be very concerned because, as we've seen, these increased conflicts, like with the Marsh lions and the Mara. There was also a poisoning recently in Amboseli with one of the lion guardians lions there. There's more and more conflicts in Tanzania that I think we're potentially going to see that decline continue unless there's some drastic new approaches. And I think one important thing, at least for Tanzania, is there are many areas that would be more comparable to the Mount Kenya situation where they should consider adding fences. And then even in places like in Kenya, like around the Mara, there might have to be some strategic fences put up. These might help a lot. There also needs to be a lot of additional efforts, both to reassure the local population that their health and safety matters, and I think that's where fencing does help. Also having a greater sense of participation and revenue sharing, that's clearly very important. So I think there are things that can still be attempted, but it's going to be challenging because the human population in East Africa is still growing quite rapidly, and these larger issues are getting closer and closer to the core area of these parks.
Right. Lena Mungeto, in summarizing, and Craig Parker has talked about the various methods that could help control the human-wildlife conflict. But in terms of the Mara itself, is there a Mara management plan? What's happening there? And how can we secure the future of the lions? And how can we control the damage both for the wildlife and the community and integrate both together?
One of the things that I mentioned before is increasing the land set aside for conservation, and we can give incentives for this. If communities are able to earn money from setting aside land from conservation, that would be an incentive for them. Having said that, I think for the Marsh Pride, a sign of hope is that 2 of the younger female Pride members have recently gotten 5 cubs, and I think the Bila Shaka areas is back to the breeding, which has not happened for a number of years. So that's a hopeful note for the Marsh Pride, and that they have 5 new members. Now that area has recently been given additional protection, and we do not expect this incident to occur again. Now, we've had a lot of community sensitization and letting the communities know about the impact that such an action can have on their livelihood and on the community. So I think in terms of that and the revenue sharing aspect, and the fact that we as a government have begun the process of putting in the management plan, which is actually a regulatory requirement in the new Wildlife Act, as well as a very necessary. So you'll be seeing some changes coming up very soon, and putting in stronger management in the Mara, as well as enacting the Mara management plan, which is already on course.
And that's all we have time for this week. Thank you to my guests for their insights. In Nairobi, the Narrow County Executive for Tourism and Wildlife, Lena Munge. And in Minneapolis, in the United States, Dr. Craig Parker. He's a director of the Lion Research Center at the University of Minnesota. Remember, you can also join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.